Hey everybody, it's Dan here from Sci-Fi Models and Stuff, and lately I've been playing a lot of the game Metroid Dread on the Nintendo Switch, and I absolutely love it. I was always a fan of the original side-scroller games on the NES, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy Advance, so this really kind of fits right in there. Playing this game really reminded me that I would love to have a Samus or a Metroid kit, but I just couldn't find anything I liked. I scrolled around and looked at some resin kits and some 3D prints and all sorts of different sculpts, but I really just couldn't find anything I liked. And then I found this on Pinterest. It's some kind of Gundam Metroid combination, and look at this thing. It's got everything. Jetpack! Gundam! Hi! I have to have this. But it's not a kit, I don't think. It's some kind of Kitbash, and I don't really know anything about Gundams, so I set to searching. But that didn't really work, so I went to the next best thing, the Gundam subreddit board. There's a ton of people here that know just about everything there is to know about Gundam kits. Turns out that was the perfect place to go, and within about 5 minutes I found out exactly what I needed to know. Turns out it's a bash of this kit and this one. And looking at the final product, we can definitely see that this is the case. Alright, so now I know what kits to look for, so let's buy them. But then I ran into my next problem. These kits were expensive. I don't know if they're rare or out of circulation or what. I found a whole bunch on eBay for way more than I wanted to spend, and everywhere else seemed to be out of stock. So it took me a little bit, but after a little bit of searching and a little bit of patience, I was finally able to get these kits in the mail today. And let's start with this one. This is a pretty standard HD Gundam kit, so fairly low detail, fairly low number of parts. The main torso looks to be pretty similar to what we're looking for, so let's start there. Okay, so we've got the main torso built in. There's just a few things to note. First off, these horns have got to go, so we will have to fill those holes. The jetpack looks pretty good, the front of the chest looks good. These tubes down here I'll probably replace with some springs. And I assemble the waist too, which is just a few parts. So looking at the legs first, it looks like just about everything above the knee comes from this kit. And assembly is pretty straightforward, so we built both of them. And in terms of the build, I think that's all the main parts that come from this kit. So we'll set this aside and get to work on this one. The bottom parts of the legs come from this kit, and it looks like they're pretty much interchangeable. So we'll just follow the instructions and stick them together. Comparing this to the end result, this looks pretty good, so let's do the other one too. Okay, the left arm is also from this kit, and it looks to be pretty much stock. And the finished result looks pretty good, so we'll move on to the right arm. Now the right arm is a little more complicated. It looks like the shoulder comes from this kit, but the arm itself comes from the Helmwige kit. Luckily these kits are fairly interchangeable, so the shoulder fits right onto the arm. The gun arm itself is actually part of a giant sword included in the first kit. This is in 2 pieces, so I get those glued up and ready to chop down. I'm going to cut this in half somewhere around here, and then sand a nice straight edge onto it. This can then be glued onto the right arm that we built earlier. And we'll probably add some extra details later on. Okay, so we're pretty much done with the build at this point. I'm not crazy about the jetpack here. I like the idea, I like that it moves, but there's a lot of empty space between it and the body. Okay, so now we've got the complete build, so let's get down to customizing. I think the best way to fix this gap is to chop down the joint a little bit. You can see it normally sticks out, but that should help. So let's cut the joint here. We'll sand it flush, then we'll reglue that joint. And that's much better. I also want to drill out these exhausts and replace them. I found these metal engine bells, which should look pretty nice. I actually had to open up the kit parts quite a bit, but after sanding and filing a little bit, these engine replacements fit very nicely. And to add a little bit more detailing, I have these photo etch grills. Next, I want to replace these tube parts with some 1mm spring. And this is really pretty simple. You drill the holes out a little bit, put the spring in, and then shape it to the desired position. This is pretty minor, but as always with plastic kits, there are a few seams and marks that need to be filled with putty. Scribing detail lines is very popular with Gundam kits, and I admit that I'm not very skilled at this, but I add a few just for fun. When I think I'm done, I put a light wash on the parts. This helps to clean out the panel line and lets me make sure I scribe deep enough. The back of the leg looks pretty good, but I do want to cover it up a little bit. I played around with some kit parts and found this, which I thought looked pretty good. There is an empty space in the armor though, so I want to make sure I fill that with something. First I cut a small piece of plastic card, then I cut down some styrene tube, sand the pieces flat, and add some jet nozzle details. After a little polishing, it looks pretty good. And if you happen to look up the legs, you'll see this extra detail. Next we move on to the helmet. I cut the horns off at an earlier stage, so I fill in the hole with some 2-part epoxy. A little bit of shaping and sculpting, and I think it looks pretty good. And lastly, I add some brass tube to the arm cannon. This makes it look a little bit more like a gun. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to painting. First, what I'm going to do is sort all my parts by color. The main colors of the armor are going to be yellow, orange, and red. To ensure a nice even base coat, first I'm going to prime with Mr. Surfacer 1500. For the yellows, I'm using Tamiya flat yellow. This goes on very thin, so you have to do multiple coats and build the color up. I add some shading on the edges with a little bit of orange-yellow tone. For the parts that are red, I do a little pre-shading in black. It's nothing too extreme, but it does help to add some variation to the color. And my base coat for that is Tamiya flat red. This goes on a little bit thin as well, so multiple coats are a must. The visor is sprayed in a bright neon green, and then the helmet can be assembled. On the jetpack, I add some metal effects, first by doing a gloss black base coat, and then spraying some chrome over that. It can be somewhat difficult finding a nice orange coat, but this Vallejo Air Orange Rust seems to do pretty well. The only downside is it needs about 4 or 5 coats to really build up that color. I never really know what to do with Gundam frames, so first I primed in black, and then I added some dark gray over that to add some variation. With the gray, I point the airbrush down so that lighter spots are at the top of the build, and parts lower on the frame are in shadow. The metal springs are primed in black, and then a little bit of light gray is sprayed over the top to add some contrast. The metal nozzles are really pretty easy to paint. I just add a black acrylic wash over the top, which looks pretty good. With those painted, they can finally be installed. A little bit of super glue works wonders here. And with all parts base coated, it's time for the first assembly. Things are looking pretty good so far. I still need to finish the leg armor. This piece here is two-tone, so that gets a little bit tricky. I've also got to add the rear leg armor and of course the gun arm. The two-tone leg armor is masked off, and I'm able to spray the yellow over the top of the orange. And I hand paint a few details, like these wires on the back of the legs. This might not come out perfect just yet, but a little bit of wash at the end should tidy this up. The rear leg armor is done, and I can super glue that into position. Painting the gun arm is a little bit complicated. I spray a dark gray base coat around the forearm, and the gun itself gets a coat of a grayish green. I also paint the barrel with a little bit of a darker gray. Next, I go around the whole kit and I apply a selective black oil wash. This seeps into all the panel lines and nooks and crannies and should look pretty good when you wipe it off. After that dries, I do a little bit of a heavier wash with a brownish black, which should add a little bit of weathering and a little bit of shading to the base colors. This dries for about an hour or so, and then I use a Q-tip to kind of blend in the oil paint. Now, for some additional detailing, I bought these 3mm glass beads online. I'm going to add a little bit of green ink to tint that, and then I'll install those into the arms. I use just a touch of clear varnish as an adhesive, and then those fit right into these slots. And for the very last part, I actually 3D printed off this little energy tank. So first I primed that in a dark gray, then I add some white highlighting on the side. Next I add some transparent purple to kind of give it a mottled look. And I use a pencil to draw in some of the fine details. Doesn't look exactly perfect, but again, with an oil wash, that'll help quite a bit. That fits right on the back, and the model's done.